Hello, friends, and welcome to this, my latest horror ranking video. And this one was really inspired by my review of all the films I'd watched in October. I was reflecting on Black Phone 2 and noticed I essentially talked about Nightmare on Elm Street quite a lot, how there's sort of a lot of overlap between that film, sort of what they do with the grabber in that film, and Freddy Krueger, the villain of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And it really put me in mind what I really wanted to do was do a ranking of the Elm Street franchise. So that is what we have today. Um, and it's a weird one to discuss because the franchise is, as ever, in limbo. It's been 15 years since the last film. We've had some sort of subsequent appearances, Robert Englund appearing in other Goldbergs and stuff. But it's in a sort of a franchise rights limbo. The rights are with the Wes Craven estate. Heaven Langenkamp, Robert Englund, stars of the original film, have talked about sort of potentially returning, but at the moment it doesn't seem this is likely to happen. Or at least there seems to be no sort of immediate likelihood, unless, we may be surprised. But for the moment, this is a dormant beast, so let us reflect upon all 9 of these films as it is at the moment. And this is a list that I have borrowed from Cody Leach in his own ranking video. I'll put the link to this tier list in the comments below, and also a link to his own video. You see the 5 tiers here: dreamy, good, watchable, the film's all right; snooze fest, it's fine but it's a bit boring; and then nightmare, these films are sort of horribly, horribly bad. The franchise, I think, very much encompasses all 5 of those tiers. It's worth me stating as well that these are my own personal reflections, my own personal rankings. So if you don't agree with me, nothing wrong with that. We all have our own opinions. And please do comment below and let me know how you rank the franchise. Let me know where I'm wrong. Let me know where I'm right. Let me know what you'd put high, what you'd put low. I would love to hear and have these conversations. Before we kick off, as is the norm of all of my ranking videos, I'm going to give a little sort of plot summary of the film before I discuss them. So be ready with that. I'll give that sort of a warning for spoilers and discussion. I'll give a sort of a very general overview, and then after that overview, I'll go into the film in more detail, and the sort of spoilers are there. So here we begin, and we begin with the original film, 1984, Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street, and the film that gave birth to the franchise and the character of Freddy Krueger. So in this film, a group of young teenagers on Elm Street start having dreams of the same figure, a mysterious burnt man in a fedora with his sort of knife hand. This is Freddy Krueger. They eventually discover that Krueger was a local child murderer who was killed by the parents of this of the town of Springwood after he was sort of acquitted on a technicality, and so he is returned to wreak vengeance by targeting their children in their dreams. So this is my generic summary, and so to break into it, I mean, the film is iconic. This is a film that has stood the test of time, for a reason. And it's quite an interesting one to watch now because of sort of some of the ways it plays is very dissimilar to many of the earlier Elm Street and the later Elm Street films, I would say. I love Craven's framing of Freddy in this. So Robert Englund is terrifying. And sort of there's a lot of keeping Freddy in shadows, keeping him this really dark figure. There is also an excellent sort of subversion, a rug pull, in which initially we think we are following the character of Tina, played by Amanda Weiss. I think that's how that's pronounced. She's set up as the main character, and then she is killed sort of unceremoniously in a very sort of effective kill scene where she's dragged around her room in the dreamscape. And before we move on to our sort of our main characters, before the focus shifts to Nancy Thompson, an excellent Heather Langenkamp, and her family, John Saxon as her father, Ronnie Blakely as her mother. When I first saw it, I didn't know that was going to be the thing, and my God, that was a shock. Yes, this is a Freddy who is probably terrifying, and this is a very, very tight film. I think the mystery is unveiled really very effectively, and sort of this is a film that doesn't really let up. And that's not to say that it is a perfect film. So it's often remarked upon as sort of like a final scene. Um, that is essentially like a coda that no one needed because we needed one sort of last shock. Um, what Nancy discovers in the film is essentially Freddy and objects from the dream world can be pulled into the real world, and so she does this to defeat him. She sets up a bunch of booby traps and things. And I'm going to be honest in that I always found it a little bit goofy in truth. This sort of moment of empowerment, and Langenkamp really sells it. But I always found the sort of setup of that a bit goofy, really. I don't know how you defeat Freddy, and as sort of the subsequent films showed, this may have been the best of the bunch. But what I would say is, for those sorts of minor sort of things that always sort of pull me out a little bit, there's a film that stood the test of time. Everything works here. The acting works here. The scripting, the music, Charles Bernstein's iconic score, which I should mention, it all sort of adds up into a sort of a glorious film. And I would have no hesitation really in putting this in the dreamy territory. This is sort of, it started here for a reason. Let me shift on to film number 2, which takes a bit of a right turn, as it were. So it follows a new family that have moved into Nancy's house, and their son is called Jesse. He's played by Mark Patton, and he starts essentially having dreams. And he discovers that his dreams, his nightmares, I should say, are sort of really sort of equivalent to the nightmares of his friend Lisa. It transpires that sort of Freddy is using Jesse to sort of try and emerge back into the real world. And it's kind of a possession film, as well as a sort of an Elm Street film. This is my sort of generic summary. This is an interesting film. So this is really, it's dark. This is sort of a real brutal Freddy. And in comparison, arguably in comparison to the first film, this is probably Freddy, played by Robert Englund, at his darkness. And the film is also often discussed. This is often discussed as well in relation to Nightmare on Elm Street 2. It's sort of the homoeroticism of the film. There is a perceived film, and there's a lot of discussion about sort of whether the character of Jesse is kind of sort of repressed as a homosexual. There are sort of obvious gay dimensions, in particular, sort of they visit a gay bar at one point. But yes, this is a lot of the discussion about Elm Street 2 has really essentially been concerned with sort of this potential subtext or indeed textual dimension. When it was released, it was referred to as the gayest horror film ever by one publication, and it's been it has been reclaimed by that cult dimension, by that as a cult film for a queer audience. I have no commentary there. What I would say is the film as a film, and it is obviously it's markedly lesser than the original film. And there are reasons for this. Although I quite like Patton's acting, he sort of is not anywhere near as compelling as Langenkamp. And the sort of the narrative, the way that Freddy is constructed in this film is sort of almost possessing, transforming into Jesse and back again, doesn't overly stack up with the Freddy that we've met in the previous film. And he is brutal. There's a sort of excellent sequence in which Freddy emerges at a sort of a pool party, which I really quite like. But yeah, this is not a film I overly love in terms of the franchise. It's dark and I don't overly love. I'm trying to think where to put it really. I'm going to put it in watchable. I think watchable is where I'm going to go. And yeah, I think that's probably the fairest reflection for myself. Let's move on to Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. So this is 1987, and this sees Langenkamp return. And essentially, this film sees Freddy try and kill the last of the Elm Street children. I mean, a bunch of them have been placed in a sort of mental institution for allegedly attempting suicide, really sort of Freddy attacking them in their dreams. Nancy arrives. She's an intern and realizes that they are being attacked and killed by Freddy. And she helps some of these children sort of find their dream powers, as they're called. So they have sort of abilities within the dreams that they can harness to attempt to essentially defeat Freddy, to kill him once and for all. There is a doctor in the institution who's sort of meeting a spirit that turns out to be Freddy's mother, and who gives him the clues on how to do this. And both Donald, that is Nancy's father, and Nancy, they sort of work in different realms, They sort of have different approaches to helping the children and the doctor try and fight Freddy. So that's my little summary. I'm trying not to give stuff away there. This film is, again, often, when people talk about the Elm Street films, there's a general consensus that there are only two good ones, the first one and this one. I like this film, it's fun. So at this point, Freddy is starting to become, in popular culture, almost a phenomenon. You're seeing sort of Freddy merchandise, you're seeing him be a celebrity. It's quite interesting, really, given sort of the nature of the character as a child murderer. This is probably the last one. This is probably where the balance of sort of a dark horror Freddy and a more sort of comedy Freddy is best, I would say. And with this, we have sort of a great cast of characters again. So sort of returning Nancy, returning John Saxon, who just sort of doesn't get too much to do, but sort of makes those moments count. And then the young people as well. So Patricia Arquette is sort of the lead character here, Kristen Parker. A bunch of the teens. There is a sort of, they are a good cast. It's a good cast. And again, sort of talking goofiness, I personally find the Dream Power gimmick a little goofy in places. But I think that this really is, it's realised best here. I would say, again, sort of this sort of dream logic again, before it becomes too silly. This is the problem with the franchise, is sort of in its middle, it becomes too silly. Some great deaths here, in particular one sort of in which Freddy attacks a sleepwalker by sort of tearing sort of tendons out of his arms and operating him like a marionette. The visual is superb. This is a film I like, and there was quite sort of touching moments, really, at the end of the movie. I'm not going to say anything. If you've seen the films, you know what they are. I don't think it's on par with the original. I like the film. I'm not one of these people who sort of, sorry, I'm trying to play something good. Don't kill me, everyone. I've never thought it was sort of as amazing as it's made out to be. To sort of the extent of this is sort of one of the best films of the franchise. That's never really been my own personal view. So that is where I place it. That is where it will go. Let's leap ahead to Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, 1988. And this is sort of a direct sequel, almost, to Elm Street 3. So Kristen, that was the Patricia Arquette character, now being played here by Tuesday Knight, sort of accidentally releases Freddy, and he attacks some of the children, and he essentially starts wiping out the survivors from the first film. It comes to Kristen, but she transfers her dream path to a friend at school, Alice, played by Lisa Wilcox. Alice inadvertently sort of develops the ability to pull people into her dreams while she sleeps. And she's sort of, providing more victims for Freddy. And she also starts to take on the traits and sort of get their dream abilities, as it were, and then becomes the Dream Master of the title. But we return. So Elm Street 4 is a strange film, and that is I'm going to be honest, I always found it sort of the most boring one, in truth. And so this is really the turning point where the film starts to become more goofy, where Freddy starts to become more of a comedy villain. It still tries to play, I think, a bit too seriously. And I don't love it. There are some great deaths here. So one of the characters is attacked and sort of turned to the sort of wonderful body horror sequence in which she's turned into a cockroach. And there is a sort of a time loop moment that I really quite like, and it's really quite effective. But this is not really my favorite film. There are some. This is Freddy starting to become sort of almost a caricature of the comedy Freddy, which I don't love. And I would say too that I don't overly find the scripting here that interesting. So the subsequent ones, although they are they're very goofy, as I'm going to discuss in a moment, at least they're sort of fun. Elm Street 4, I don't overly find that fun. I want them to be scary, or I want them to be fun. And Elm Street 4 is not, to my mind, really either. It's one of my personal least favourite, Elm Street 4, sorry. It is one of my least favourites in the franchise. I am gonna. I would put this towards. Is it that bad? Am I putting it in nightmare territory? Is this what I think? I don't know. This is what I think. Let's put it in snooze stuff somewhere. It's not a bad film. It's just, to my personal view, a bit of a boring one that I don't love. So I think that's probably appropriate for there. Let's move on to Elm Street 5. So again, so the Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, released 1989, which again sort of follows on from the film. This is again sort of a direct sequel to number 4, and is concerned with Alice returning Lisa Wilcox, and her partner Dan from Danny Hassel from the film Prior, and they are having a baby. So Alice is pregnant, and starts to essentially Freddy starts using Alice's babies and the dreams of that child to start claiming new victims. This is, again, these are two films that I don't overly love. So sort of these characters returned because Elm Street 4 was sort of a major financial success. It was the highest grossing film at that point, and sort of Freddy Mania was in full swing. There's a TV spin-off, there was lots of merchandise. This was a really, really high, sort of the high watermark for Freddy Krueger and the franchise. The film has kind of, in a sense, almost been chopped together. So there were sort of the script bounces about, and there are sort of a lot of writers attached. So what Leslie Bowen wrote, but sort of if you see the behind the scenes sort of story of this film, there are a lot of additions, all the gothic stuff, the castle, the dungeon, all that sort of stuff, emerged as a result of the director wanting to have more gothic imagery. This is director Stephen Hopkins. It's a film that kind of, again, it doesn't quite get the balance right. There are elements where it wants to be scary, but it's also really very silly in places. Particularly where we have sort of Super Freddy, this daft comic book character who Freddy transforms someone into a comic book character and then cuts them up. I Yeah, I don't really know what to make of this. Again, so I rewatched them all in preparation for this, and it's a film that I'm struggling to bring to mind. I find it, again, really quite boring. I know this is not sort of the popular view, but I always found these films to be sort of where the franchise snags a little. In truth, there's a lot of boring stuff. It's generally my main takeaway for this one because I find it really quite boring. So I'm going to place this. I'm going to put it as a nightmare, the first nightmare of the franchise, because I do just find it dull, and it's a film that feels like there were too many cooks. I think that's probably the fairest way to describe it. It feels like there are too many cooks. The plot's confusing, and I'm not overly invested in any of the characters. And Freddy was getting somewhat tired here. So the decision was made. So the next film, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, 1991. The decision was made in the face of diminishing box office returns, a lack of interest in Freddy popularly, to wipe him out. So this film was meant to be the final film. Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. So in this film, there's sort of an amnesiac guy who is looking to find Freddy's daughter. He needs the daughter to be able to escape Springwood, and the reason for this is because he wants to essentially create new Elm Streets around America, begin new killing sprees, because he's run out of children. The daughter starts to, through dreams, discover new elements of Freddy's past. Eventually they have a clash and she kills him. Again, we say about this is a film that it delves too much into the Freddy character, and he is much too silly here. There's a level of wisecracking we just don't need. It's the point where it becomes too much, it becomes boring. And this is, there is a sense here that the franchise is somewhat running on fumes. Let me say that. That's probably the fairest way to put it. We didn't need all of the sort of Freddy mythology. We really didn't. There are elements here that you can enjoy, I think. So Lisa Zane is the central character of this woman known as Maggie Burrows, a doctor, who eventually learn is Freddy's daughter. I find her to be vaguely more interesting, although she also sort of doesn't really get very much to do. And although I don't like sort of the goofy Freddy, the sort of being able to see more of Robert Englund's performance is never a bad thing, even if it's on the campier side rather than the darker side. It is very much sort of running on fumes kind of film, and I would think, I think it needs to go in the bottom as well. This is also sort of nightmare tier for Freddy Krueger. Let me move on to a new film in the franchise. So this was Wes Craven's return to the Elm Street franchise. In 1994, it was New Nightmare. This is an Elm Street film, but sort of not. And so the film sort of is ostensibly based in reality. Heather Langenkamp returns and sort of plays a version of herself, as does Wes Craven, as does Robert Englund. And the premise of this film is that since the Elm Street films have stopped, there's a sort of an entity that was contained within the franchise, and it's trying to escape into the real world. And so Heather Langenkamp needs to sort of reprise her role as Nancy to sort of defeat the demon. So this is a meta film. It's very much a meta horror. This is what Craven would go on to do more popularly, and in Scream a few years later. It's an Elm Street film in the sense that Elm Street is sort of the backdrop of this, but it is not an Elm Street film in a kind of a conventional way. I really like this. So this is sort of when we discuss Freddy here, we are discussing essentially a demon that takes the form of Freddy, but it's not Freddy. And it's darker. This is perhaps the darkest the character has been, and it's not quite the Freddy character. It is meant to be some sort of demon. And I think this is sort of the Freddy is stylized. England's performance is darker, and the makeup, the effects are stylized to be more demonic, and it really shines through. And I really quite like the narrative. So Langenkamp plays herself. She's got a child. She has a husband, and she's also undergoing nightmares, and she's being pursued by a stalker. All these sorts of things. She gets a lot more to do here, and I prefer the performance in this to the Langenkamp of the first Elm Street, very much so. It's a film I really like, and sort of it's frustrating. So frustratingly, it bombed at the time. It didn't bomb, but it was the lowest grossing of all the Nightmare films, and it was meant to be the sort of the thing that really kicked the franchise perhaps back into gear. But I think it's one of Craven's best films. I think it's one of the best films of the franchise, and I really like it. Other issues. It's 2 hours long. There are elements of sag. Sequences where sort of the sleepwalking child crosses the highway, for example, and for an Elm Street slasher film, there's not too much in the way of bloodshed, and so if you're after that, that's something really very much to know in mind. The ending again is perhaps a little bit goofy in terms of sort of we enter a sort of a demonic castle and sort of the boiler room and the monster sort of pursues the son. Other than all, I really like it. I think this is one of the strongest films in the franchise. I have no hesitation whatsoever of putting it up in the dreamy territory. I'm wondering if I sort of want to place it even above. It's probably a film I would revisit more than I would the original Elm Street in truth. So I'm going to place it first. That is going to be controversial, I know, but run with me there. Leap ahead, right? 2003, we had the meeting that had been promised in several films up to this point, Freddy versus Jason. So in this film, Freddy has grown weak because people have suppressed their fear of him. Children are being drugged and sort of he's not able to access them in their dreams. So he essentially impersonates Jason Voorhees' mother, Pamela, to send Jason to Springwood to cause panic, fear, and to sort of engender this atmosphere of fear in order that Freddy can return and start killing again. And Freddy is able to return and kill again, but then refuses to stop killing. And that's essentially there is a clash when Jason's own bloodlust clashes with Freddy's. This is a film that I think really its reputation has been restored and reclaimed, perhaps a little bit in recent years. This was a film that I can be charitable. So this could have been a lot worse, right? Talking about bringing these two characters from quite different worlds together. There are ways to have done this that could have really been much, much worse. I think it works quite well in terms of bringing Jason together, not really doing either one particular disjustice. I think this film works quite well. Let's not get in sort of any sense. So, this is a goofy film. Again, this is goofy. This is sort of a monster mash and sort of all the fun that is, bringing your toys together. And there's sort of daft stuff here. So sort of our central character, Laurie Campbell, played by Monica Keena. It's not overly compelling. There's this sort of the much remarked upon line where she sort of remarks that Freddy fears fire and Jason fears water. How can we use that? Which always gets a laugh when it's played on the big screen. But I think, this film broadly, it has to do a job. It has to sort of bring these things together. It has to break the franchises that are, in a sense, quite different, mush. And it does it quite well. Just in some elements, really very effectively. Sort of an opening kill by Jason where he sort of attacks someone in a bed. a sort of a slaughter in a cornfield. The first boiler sequence with Catherine Isabel, boiler room sequence with Catherine Isabel. You know, a lot of these elements really come together quite well. I think you have to go into this film knowing that sort of essentially two monsters fighting is going to be a little bit goofy and daft. And so if you go into that spirit, it works. It does. I think it's good, goofy fun. I quite like it. The question is, where would I put it? I would not be able to call it a good movie. I think that would be stretching the oh hello, what's going on there? That would be stretching the definition of the word. But I would say it's eminently watchable. I really quite enjoy it. I would place it above. Again, I would go to this before I would Elm Street 2. So I'm going to place it there, I think. Let's move on to the last film in the franchise, so the most recent one, and the only film that does not feature Robert Englund as Freddy. So this is a remake of the original Elm Street, released in 2010. Here, Freddy has been played by Jackie Earle Haley, and broadly speaking, it's kind of the same narrative as the original. And the young kids are being pursued by this killer, and they sort of learn more about him. This film, where I say Freddy vs. Jason, has been sort of popularly reclaimed. This film was hated on its release and has, broadly speaking, been hated ever since. Because it tends really to kind of do the same thing as the original, but worse. Any new changes don't really work. So the sort of major changes that they make Freddy into a sort of a predator rather than an outright murderer. And it's really at the same time as they do this, they introduce a sort of potential plotline about him maybe being innocent. Maybe he was killed by the parents, but he was not the guilty party. That's quite an interesting thread. But then by bringing this in, it sort of really complicates the idea of rooting. There's also, I think, a real miscast in that we have Rooney Mara as Nancy, and she, no pun intended, sort of sleepwalks through the entire film. She's evidently not interested. And by contrast, Katie Cassidy plays Chris, who is kind of the Tina equivalent of this film. And she is a much more compelling lead, and it sort of, I think if you'd reverse the things, if you'd have made her the lead, this film would sort of easily shoot up the rankings, really so. There's a lot of overly CGIing stuff here. There is a lot of sort of things that you've seen in the original that are sort of just done worse. This is a film that comes, 25 years later, and there's just a lot of stuff that is done worse with worse effects. It's a baffling thing. It's worth stating, I think, in all fairness to the film, that although it's sort of it's boring and not particularly enjoyable as a watch, it suffers a lot by comparison. If this was its own original property, it may perhaps have more of a positive reception or reputation than I think it does. I think Jackie Earle Haley was excellent casting as Kruger. He's a guy who could do that sort of scary boogeyman effect really, really well. But the film doesn't really make use of him particularly well. But I think there's sort of some elements there that might have worked, but don't. Where do I put it then? Is it? I mean, every conventional logic says I make it a nightmare. But I don't. I'm torn. My natural gut was to put it as a snooze fest because I don't think it's. That feels right to me. I know sort of Elm Street purists and fans will be sort of shouting at me for not putting the film dead last, but that just to my mind feels really, really right. So that is what I'm going to do. So there we go, my Elm Street franchise ranking and some thoughts on all the films. Where this is a franchise that's has very much gone through its own ups and downs, and I'd be so intrigued to hear what people make of my own thoughts, and I'd be intrigued to hear people's own thoughts as well. And please tell me how you would rank this franchise. What have I got wrong here? Because my gut is that people will have many, many views on this. If you've stuck with me, thank you so much for watching. This has been enjoyable and interesting, and please, if you have any comments, any other franchises you'd like me to rank, or any horror videos you'd like me to make, let me know. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much. I will look forward to seeing you all in the next one.